Part 1. Aphotic 9. I spent 14 months as the senior marine geologist aboard Aphotic Station 9, a deep ocean research platform anchored at just under 6,000 meters in a stretch of trench the public charts don't name and the classified ones call, with a bureaucratic flatness that still makes me laugh in the worst possible way, site designation Kestrel Fold. I am telling you this account not because I expect you to believe all of it. I've stopped expecting that of almost anyone, including some mornings myself, but because 4 of the 6 people I served with down there did not come back up, and I have decided that their names deserve to exist somewhere outside a classified incident report that will, if the last 8 months of stonewalling are any indication, never see daylight. My name is Freya. I'm going to use my first name only, the way I've started doing with everything since I left that program, because I've found that anonymity, even the thin kind, makes it easier to say the parts of this that still don't sit right in my chest. Aphotic 9 was funded officially as a hydrothermal vent research platform, a joint academic and government initiative studying chemosynthetic ecosystems at extreme depth, the kind of legitimate, unglamorous science that actually does happen at facilities like that most of the time, most days. The station itself was a squat, pressure-rated cylinder maybe 40 meters along its longest axis, divided into cramped modules for sleeping, operations, medical, engineering, and a small galley that doubled on quieter nights as the only real communal space any of us had. We ate together, mostly out of necessity rather than any deep camaraderie at first. 6 people who'd been assigned to the same rotation by an institution more concerned with credentials than compatibility, learning slowly, over 11 largely uneventful months, to actually like each other in the specific, hard-won way isolated crews sometimes do. We had 6 souls aboard for the rotation that changed everything. Our station chief, Dr. Owen Marsh, a career oceanographer who'd run 3 previous deep rotations without incident and who I trusted, going in, more than almost anyone else I'd worked with. A careful, methodical man in his 50s who kept a battered paperback novel in his jacket pocket at all times and read maybe 2 pages of it a week, more out of habit than any real progress through the book. Our chief engineer, Kestrel Doyle, who everyone called Kes and who kept that station's aging life support systems running through sheer stubborn competence. A woman in her 30s who'd grown up on offshore platforms and treated Aphotic 9's constant minor mechanical failures with the weary, affectionate exasperation of someone dealing with a familiar difficult relative. Our biologist Iris Whitlock, whose entire professional life was built around the genuinely strange, resilient life that clusters around deep vents, and who was, I think, more excited than any of us about what we eventually found, right up until she wasn't, younger than the rest of us, barely 30, still carrying the specific wonder of someone who'd chosen this career because the deep ocean had fascinated her since childhood rather than because it happened to be where the funding was. Our communications and systems officer, Tobias Renner, quiet, meticulous, the kind of person who noticed anomalies in a data stream days before anyone else even thought to look, who spent his off hours running elaborate signal processing exercises on old radio astronomy datasets purely for his own enjoyment, and our station physician, Dr. Amara Solis, who joined the rotation only 6 weeks before everything started, replacing a previous physician who'd rotated out for a family emergency, and who I have thought about since more than almost anyone else because I think she understood what was actually happening to us faster than any of the rest of us did, and it cost her more than it cost anyone. I want to give you some sense of what an ordinary day aboard that station looked like before any of this started because I think the contrast matters. Mornings meant checking overnight sensor logs over reheated coffee that never tasted quite right at that pressure. Days meant sample collection, equipment maintenance, the patient, unglamorous work of actual field science. Evenings meant whatever entertainment 6 people could manufacture for themselves in a metal box 6,000 meters underwater, card games, audiobooks, Kess's increasingly elaborate attempts to grow herbs in a hydroponic tray that kept mysteriously failing despite her engineering expertise being entirely unrelated to botany. We were, for 11 months, simply a group of competent professionals doing quiet, careful work far from anything resembling ordinary life, and I think all of us, in our own ways, had come to genuinely value that quiet. We'd been on station 11 months, deep into what should have been a routine final push of sample collection before rotation's end, when Kess's sonar array picked up a structure in the trench wall roughly 400 meters below our anchor depth that did not appear on any prior survey of that site, despite the area having been mapped, in low resolution, at least twice in the preceding decade. Part 2. The structure. I want to describe what our first survey pass actually showed, because I think the ordinariness of how it began matters for understanding how thoroughly it stopped being ordinary. It read on Kess's sonar returns as a roughly circular depression in the trench wall, perhaps 60 meters across, ringed by what the imaging suggested were regular, evenly spaced protrusions, regular enough that Owen's first working theory, stated cautiously over dinner that first night, was that we'd stumbled onto an unusually symmetrical natural mineral formation, the kind of geological curiosity that occasionally turns up at extreme depth, and occasionally turns out to be nothing more exciting than an accident of pressure and chemistry. Iris was the one who first flagged that the protrusions didn't behave like mineral formations at all once we got closer imaging. They moved. Not dramatically, not in any way that suggested locomotion in a conventional biological sense, but they shifted position subtly between successive sonar passes taken only hours apart, the way a slow-breathing organism's chest might shift a camera's framing without the organism ever appearing to move at all. We sent down our remotely operated vehicle, a small tethered submersible we called Marlowe, after an old joke about explorers and darkness that had stopped being funny by about day 3 of what followed, for a closer visual pass on our 12th day of monitoring the structure. The footage from that first pass is, as far as I know, still sitting in a classified evidence file somewhere, and I've spent considerable effort over the last 8 months trying unsuccessfully to get any confirmation of what happened to it, whether it was reviewed by anyone with the expertise to actually understand what we were looking at, or whether it simply vanished into the same bureaucratic silence that swallowed almost every other piece of physical evidence from that rotation. What Marlowe's camera actually showed at maximum zoom against the near-total blackness of that depth was not, in fact, a mineral formation, and it was not, in any conventional sense, an animal either. It was closer, in overall shape, to a structure, vaguely radial, vaguely organic, its protrusions resolving under closer light into something between coral branch and cartilage, pale, faintly luminescent along certain ridged seams in a way that had nothing to do with any bioluminescent chemistry Iris had ever documented at that depth. At the center of that radial structure was an opening, dark even against the surrounding blackness, perhaps 4 meters across, and every one of us watching that live feed in the station's cramped operations bay felt, at almost exactly the same moment, according to what everyone later admitted independently, a specific pressure behind our eyes, a low, felt rather than heard hum that seemed to originate less from Marlowe's own equipment noise and more from the structure itself. "Pull it back," Owen said, and I remember how tightly controlled his voice was, the voice of a man with 3 prior deep rotations worth of professional composure actively fighting against something his instincts were telling him considerably more urgently. Tobias at the controls tried. Marlowe's thrusters engaged, visible in the footage as a brief increase in particulate churn around the submersible's housing, and for several seconds, Tobias later clocked it at 11 seconds exactly, reviewing the footage frame by frame. The vehicle did not move at all, thrusters clearly firing, position unchanged, as though something had simply decided, without any visible mechanism for doing so, that Marlowe was not yet finished looking. I remember the specific quality of silence in that operations bay during those 11 seconds. 6 adults, all of us trained, all of us professionally accustomed to strange and unexpected readings at extreme depth, standing absolutely still, watching a small screen showing nothing more dramatic than a stationary camera feed, and yet every one of us understanding on some level below conscious articulation that we were watching something that should not have been possible happen in complete, patient silence. Kess had her hand on the emergency recall switch the entire time, ready to sever Marlowe's tether entirely if it came to that, sacrifice the vehicle rather than lose it permanently to whatever was holding it. She told me later she genuinely believed in that moment that she was about to have to make that call, and that some part of her had already grieved the loss of a machine she'd spent months personally maintaining. Then, exactly as abruptly as it started, the resistance ended. Marlowe's thrusters caught properly, the vehicle reversing away from that dark central opening at a speed that read, even through the footage, as something close to panic, if a remotely piloted vehicle can be said to panic at all. Iris, watching over Tobias's shoulder, let out a breath she'd apparently been holding the entire 11 seconds, and said in a voice trying hard for scientific detachment and not quite managing it, "I want to go back down and look again. I know how that sounds. I want to go back down anyway." Part 3, the hum. We got Marlowe back eventually, the resistance simply stopped as abruptly as it had started, and the vehicle returned to its cradle with no visible damage and, disturbingly, no clear technical explanation for the 11-second stall that Tobias could ever identify in the vehicle's system's logs. But something had already changed aboard Aphotic 9 by the time we recovered it, something none of us named clearly for another 2 full days, though I think looking back, all 6 of us felt the first traces of it within hours of that first close pass. The hum did not stop when Marlowe surfaced. It became, over the following 48 hours, a low, persistent presence throughout the station, not loud, not even always consciously noticeable, but felt, the specific way you feel a large ship's engine through the soles of your feet long after you've stopped consciously listening for it. Kes ran every diagnostic she had on our own life support and ballast systems, certain at first that we were picking up some mechanical fault of our own rather than anything originating from the structure 400 meters below us. She found nothing. Every system aboard Aphotic 9 tested within normal parameters, and yet the hum persisted, faint, constant, worse. Every one of us agreed on this independently before we ever compared notes. Worse at night. In the artificial cycle of dimmed lighting the station used to maintain some semblance of a normal circadian rhythm at a depth where the sun had never once reached. Iris was the first to describe hearing something more specific within the hum, on our second night after the Marlowe incident, sitting in the galley at what would have been close to 2 in the morning topside, unable to sleep. She described it, hesitantly, almost apologetically, as something like a chorus, not words, not anything she could transcribe, but a quality of layered, overlapping tone that struck her, she said, as unmistakably vocal in origin, dozens or perhaps hundreds of distinct threads woven together into something that was, despite having no describable melody or rhythm, somehow unmistakably a kind of singing. "It's probably just the hull," Owen said at the time, in the tone of a man trying hard to believe his own reassurance. "Deep pressure does strange things to how sound propagates. It's easy to pattern match noise into something that sounds like voices when you're exhausted, and running on a schedule this disrupted." Tobias, our systems officer, ran a full spectral analysis on the ambient acoustic data from our external hydrophone array the following day, expecting, like the rest of us wanted to expect, some mundane mechanical or geological explanation. What he found instead, and showed the rest of us gathered around his monitor in the operations bay with an expression I'd never seen on his normally unflappable face before, was a genuinely structured, patterned signal, embedded within what should have been ambient trench noise, repeating on a cycle of just under 6 minutes, with a spectral complexity that Tobias, who had a background in signal analysis well beyond what our modest station budget usually required of him, said matched nothing he'd ever encountered in 11 years of deep ocean acoustic work, biological or geological. "It's not random," he said. "And it's not simple enough to be geological. I don't know what else to tell you. Whatever's making this signal, it's structured the way language is structured. I don't know what it's saying. I don't think saying is even the right word for whatever this actually is. But it is not noise." I remember that meeting stretching on for almost an hour past when it should have ended. All 6 of us crowded into a space built comfortably for 3, taking turns with Tobias's headphones, listening to a slowed, filtered version of the signal he'd prepared specifically to make its structure more perceptible to untrained ears. Kes described it, when her turn came, as sounding like a room full of people humming the same low notes slightly out of sync with each other, close enough to unison that it read as a single sound until you really concentrated, at which point it seemed to fracture, briefly, into dozens of individual threads before reassembling. Owen, characteristically cautious, kept returning to plausible mundane explanations, some unusual resonance interaction between the trench's geology and deep current flow, some biological chorusing behavior among a vent community none of us had fully catalogued yet. And I remember how hard he worked over those first days, to keep articulating those alternatives out loud, as though saying them enough times might make one of them true by sheer repetition. I didn't sleep well that first week either, though it took me longer than most of the others to admit it. My dreams, when I did sleep, carried a specific quality I'd never experienced before. Not nightmares exactly, nothing that resolved into clear, frightening imagery I could describe afterward, but a persistent, low-grade sense of being called toward something, the way you might feel drawn toward a familiar voice in a crowded room before you've consciously identified whose voice it is. I mentioned this to Amara on the 5th day, almost apologetically, expecting her to have some simple explanation involving stress or dehydration or the general disorientation of extended deep rotations. She didn't offer one. She wrote it down instead, carefully, in a small notebook she'd started keeping separately from her official station logs, and asked me gently whether the others had mentioned anything similar. Part 4. What Amara understood first. Dear Amara Solis, our station physician, was the one who first connected what was happening to the acoustic signal to what was happening inside each of us individually over the following week, and I want to walk through this part of the account carefully because I think it's the part that makes this story different from every other deep-sea horror story you've probably already heard, and because I think Amara's specific insight, arriving as early as it did, is very likely the reason two of us made it back to the surface at all. She started quietly, keeping notes on all six of us: sleep patterns, appetite, mood, the ordinary vitals a station physician tracks as a matter of routine even without a specific reason for concern. Within a week of the Marlowe incident, her notes documented a consistent, escalating pattern across every member of the crew except herself. Increasingly vivid, increasingly similar dreams, all of us independently reporting the sensation of being underwater without a suit, without equipment, moving with impossible ease through absolute blackness toward a source of that same layered, chorus-like humming, and all of us, without exception, describing the dream not as frightening but as something closer to homesickness, an overwhelming, aching desire to keep moving toward the sound, interrupted every single time by waking. I think it's speaking to something underneath language, Amara told me directly on the 9th day, in the relative privacy of the station's small medical bay, where she'd asked me to come in under the pretext of a routine check. Not to your conscious mind. I don't think it's trying to communicate information the way Tobias is looking for information. I think it's doing something closer to what a lullaby does to an infant, or what certain frequencies do to induce a trance state in ritual contexts across dozens of documented human cultures, bypassing the parts of your brain that evaluate and consent, and going straight for something older, something that responds to rhythm and repetition before it ever gets a chance to ask whether it should. To what end? I asked her, and I remember she looked at me for a long moment before answering, the specific look of a physician deciding how much of a hard truth a patient can actually absorb in one sitting. I don't know yet, she said. But I know Iris has stopped eating properly over the last 4 days, and I know Owen recorded 3 straight nights of almost identical dream content in his own log before I ever showed him what patterns I was seeing in the rest of you, and I know that whatever this is, it does not appear to be treating our conscious skepticism as much of an obstacle. Skepticism is a cognitive process. I don't think this is targeting cognitive processes at all. She showed me her notebook that same afternoon, pages of small, careful handwriting cross-referencing each of our sleep logs, appetite changes, and reported dream content against Tobias's acoustic recordings, and I remember being struck, looking at it, by how methodically she'd been building this case in near-total isolation, unwilling, she admitted, to alarm the rest of us before she had enough data to be certain she wasn't simply pattern-matching her own anxiety onto ordinary rotation. Fatigue. I kept waiting for one of you to break the pattern, she said. For someone's dreams to just be about their family, or their last vacation or nothing at all. Nobody has. 6 for 6 every night this week, some version of moving toward that sound. I don't have a medical framework for that. I have a medical framework for shared stress responses to isolation, and this isn't shaped like that. This is shaped like something actively broadcasting. What do we do with that? I asked her, and she was quiet for a while before answering. Right now, I don't think there's anything to do except watch each other more carefully than we have been, she said. I've asked Owen to consider requesting early rotation relief. He's resistant. You know how he is about not wanting to abandon a legitimate research posting over what he keeps calling soft data. I understand his caution. I don't share it anymore. I want to be honest that I did not, at the time, fully absorb the weight of what she was telling me, because some part of me, the same part of me I think that had built an entire career around studying the deep ocean specifically because its vastness and its indifference to human comprehension had always felt, to me, more comforting than frightening, wanted very badly to believe that whatever we'd found was simply an extraordinary natural phenomenon, the kind of genuinely novel discovery a career geologist gets maybe once in a lifetime if she's lucky, rather than something that had already quietly begun working on all of us individually while we debated what to formally call it. Part 5. Iris. Iris went into the water on the 14th day. I need to describe exactly what that means because went into the water undersells badly both the physical impossibility and the horror of what actually happened. Aphotic 9 sat at just under 6,000 meters. No unsuited human being survives exposure to that depth for any measurable length of time. The pressure alone is fatal within seconds, long before oxygen deprivation or cold ever become relevant factors. And yet, at 3:14 in the morning station time, according to both Tobias's systems logs and the grainy internal camera footage from our lower equipment bay, Iris Whitlock opened the outer hatch of our small personnel airlock, a hatch that required, under normal operation, a two-person authorization sequence specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of single-person catastrophic error, and stepped through it into open water, alone in her sleepwear, without a suit, without so much as a flashlight, moving, according to the footage, with the calm, unhurried purposefulness of someone walking out to check the mail. Kes caught the alarm within seconds of the hatch cycling and had the rest of us awake and moving toward the airlock bay within under 2 minutes. But 2 minutes at that depth might as well have been 2 years. There was, of course, nothing left to recover. The outer hatch, once cycled and resealed by the station's automated safety protocols, showed no trace of Iris at all on any of our external cameras. No body, no debris, nothing except the same endless blackness we'd been staring into for 2 weeks, indifferent and unchanged. I remember standing in that airlock bay afterward, all 5 of us remaining crew crowded into a space that suddenly felt unbearably small. Nobody quite able to say anything useful, Kes running her hands over the hatch controls again and again as though repetition might somehow reveal some overlooked malfunction that would make what had just happened make ordinary mechanical sense. Owen was the one who eventually spoke, his voice flat in a way I hadn't heard from him before, informing us that protocol required him to log the incident and begin drafting an emergency report, and watching him retreat into that procedural language, incident, protocol, report, felt even in the moment like watching a man build himself a small, temporary shelter out of paperwork because the alternative was standing exposed to what had actually just happened. What haunts me most about that night, more than the impossibility of what she did, is the internal camera footage from the 90 seconds before she opened that outer hatch, footage none of us watched until nearly a day later, once the immediate shock had worn thin enough to let any of us function again. It shows Iris standing at the airlock's inner door, perfectly still, for almost a full minute, her lips moving slightly, soundlessly, in a rhythm that Tobias, running it later against his spectral analysis of the ambient signal, confirmed matched the 6-minute acoustic cycle almost exactly, as though she'd been listening to it, consciously or otherwise, long enough to have learned its rhythm well enough to move her own mouth along with it, the way you might silently mouth the words to a song you didn't consciously remember memorizing. We watched that footage twice in near silence and then Amara asked Tobias to stop, and none of us asked to see it again after that. Amara did not sleep again in any real sense, for the remaining days we spent aboard that station. She began instead an increasingly urgent campaign to get all of us to accept that our rotation needed to end immediately, regardless of the remaining data collection schedule, regardless of what it would cost any of us professionally to abandon a legitimate research posting over what our funding institution would, without direct evidence, likely characterize as a psychological incident rather than a genuine physical threat. That first full day after Iris was, in its own way, almost as difficult as the night itself, because it forced the 4 of us who remained into a conversation none of us wanted to have about what came next. Owen, still functioning at that point with the careful procedural composure that would crack so completely 2 nights later, argued that an immediate, unscheduled evacuation request would need to be justified in terms our funding institution could actually act on, and that something in the trenches speaking to us and we believe it caused Iris's death, was not, whatever its truth, a request anyone above us was likely to process quickly. Kes argued the opposite forcefully, that we should simply lie about equipment failure if that's what it took to get a vessel moving toward us faster, that Iris's life had already been the cost of caution, and she wasn't willing to see whether it needed to cost a second one before anyone with actual authority took us seriously. I remember sitting largely silent through most of that argument, caught between the part of me that agreed entirely with Kes and the part of me that still, even after everything, felt the specific pull of unfinished research, a discovery unlike anything documented in the history of our field, sitting 400 meters below us, patient and singing, waiting to be understood by someone willing to stay long enough to understand it. I don't think it's finished, Amara told us, gathered in the operations bay 2 days after Iris, all of us visibly shaken in ways we were each handling very differently, Owen retreating into rigid procedural focus, Kes into obsessive, unnecessary equipment checks, Tobias into an almost manic determination to fully decode the acoustic signal before we left, as though understanding it might somehow retroactively make sense of what had already happened. Whatever spoke to Iris hasn't stopped speaking. I don't think it's going to stop until every one of us has either left this depth or answered it the same way she did. Part 6. Owen. We requested emergency surface evacuation through our funding institution's standard channel on the 16th day, citing Iris's death and what our request, drafted carefully by Owen in consultation with Amara, described as acute psychological distress among remaining crew consistent with prolonged isolation exposure, a framing that was not entirely a lie exactly, but was also very deliberately not the full truth, because all of us had already had enough experience by that point with how a full and honest account would likely be received by anyone who hadn't personally stood in that operations bay watching Marlowe stall for 11 unexplainable seconds. Surface support informed us that a recovery vessel could reach our anchor position within 4 days. An agonizing wait, given everything we'd already lived through, but not, on its face, an unreasonable timeline for a facility at that depth and that remoteness. We spent those 4 days in what I can only describe, now as a kind of grim, deliberate discipline, minimizing sleep in shared, monitored shifts rather than individually, keeping every crew member within sight of at least one other person at all times, running Tobias's acoustic monitoring continuously in the hope of catching any change in the signal's pattern that might warn us of escalation. It was not enough for Owen. I don't fully understand even now exactly what tipped the balance for him specifically out of the 4 of us who remained, whether it was some particular vulnerability in his own history that the rest of us simply didn't know about, or whether it was, as Amara increasingly suspected, less about individual psychological vulnerability at all and more a matter of simple cruel timing. Whoever the signal's ongoing influence happened to reach a critical threshold in first. In the 2 days after Iris, I noticed small things about him that I filed away at the time as nothing more than ordinary grief, a tendency to trail off mid-sentence, staring at some fixed point past whoever he was talking to, a new habit of tapping 2 fingers against his thigh in a slow, unhurried rhythm that I did not consciously connect, until much later, to the 6-minute cycle Tobias had spent the whole rotation documenting. He was still, on the surface, entirely functional, running our reduced skeleton operations with the same careful competence he'd shown for 11 months, drafting his incident reports, checking in on each of us individually with what read at the time as simple leaderly concern for a badly shaken crew. What I know is that on the second night of our 4-day wait, Owen woke the rest of us, calm, lucid-sounding, entirely himself in every observable way except for a specific, glassy quality behind his eyes that Amara recognized instantly and that the rest of us, God help us, initially mistook for simple exhausted relief. I understand it now, he told us, sitting in the galley with all of us gathered around him in the small hours of the ship's artificial night. I know that sounds like exactly the thing I'd say if something had gotten to me the way it got to Iris. I need you to actually hear me anyway because I don't think it's malicious. I don't think malicious is even a concept that applies to something like this, any more than the ocean itself is malicious for being cold and dark and indifferent to anything that can't survive in it. I think it's just old, unimaginably old, older than anything we have language built to describe, and I think it's been alone at the bottom of this trench for longer than our entire species has existed, and I think all it actually wants, all it's ever wanted, doing whatever it did to Iris and whatever it's been doing to the rest of us every single night since Marlowe's camera first found it, is company. I asked him, my voice shaking in a way I wasn't proud of, how he could possibly know any of that, what evidence, what actual communication, could produce that specific, confident an account of something none of us could even properly perceive except as a hum in a handful of shared dreams. I don't know how I know it, he admitted, and for just a moment something like genuine uncertainty flickered across his face, the first crack in his calm since he'd started speaking. That's the part that should probably frighten me more than it does. It's not like being told something. It's more like remembering something I never actually experienced firsthand, the way you can sometimes just know the shape of a room you've never been in, if enough people have described it to you in enough detail. Except nobody's described anything to me. I just know it. I've known it clearly for about 6 hours now, and it's the most peaceful certainty I think I've ever felt about anything in my entire professional life, and I understand exactly how suspicious that should make all of you. Amara moved first, calm and fast, the way I imagine she'd been trained to move in a genuine medical emergency, physically placing herself between Owen and the corridor leading toward the airlock bay. You are not going anywhere near that hatch, she said, and you are going to sit here with me until the recovery vessel arrives, and I don't particularly care whether you think that's malicious of me. He didn't fight her, not directly. Not in the physical violent way I'd half expected watching that scene unfold. He simply looked at her for a long moment with an expression of genuine aching sadness and said quietly, "I'm not asking your permission. I already made my decision 2 nights ago, the same night we filed our request to leave. I've just been waiting for a moment when saying goodbye properly seemed possible." And then before any of the 4 of us could fully process what he'd said, he moved, not frantically, not with any visible urgency at all, simply stepping past Amara with a calm, unhurried purposefulness that somehow made it harder, not easier, to react in time, the way a slow, deliberate motion can sometimes slip past a mind braced for something sudden. Kes was the first of us to actually give chase, shouting his name, and I remember the strange, nightmarish quality of that pursuit down a corridor barely wide enough for 2 people abreast, all 3 of us close behind him, close enough at points that Kes's fingers brushed the back of his jacket, and yet somehow every single time not quite close enough to actually close the distance, as though the corridor itself had lengthened by exactly the amount necessary to keep him 1/2 step ahead of us the entire way. We reached the airlock bay maybe 4 seconds behind him. I know because Kes and I compared our memories of it obsessively afterward, both of us independently certain the gap had never been more than that, and by the time we hit the inner door, he had already cycled it and stepped through, and Kes threw herself against the reinforced viewport set into the outer hatch, screaming his name, pounding on glass thick enough that her fists made almost no sound at all against it. I remember Amara pulling her back before the outer door's automated pressure equalization sequence engaged, a safety measure none of us had ever had cause to think about before that night, and I remember the specific, unbearable calm on Owen's face in the half-second before the outer hatch opened and the black water outside simply took him, the same expression he'd worn in the galley minutes earlier, patient and certain and, worst of all, at peace. By the time the 3 of us caught up to him, he had already cycled the outer hatch using an override sequence that, Kes confirmed afterward with a horror I still remember clearly on her face, he must have spent that entire 2-day waiting period quietly, patiently working out on his own. Part 7. What surfaced? We were 3 when the recovery vessel finally reached our anchor position, myself, Kes, and Amara, all of us functioning on a combination of adrenaline, grief, and a specific brittle vigilance that none of us fully shed for months afterward. Tobias did not make it those final 2 days either, though his death, unlike Iris's and Owen's, was not a walk into an airlock. We found him on what would have been our final morning aboard Aphotic 9 in the operations bay at his console, headphones still on, having apparently spent the entirety of that last night running the ambient acoustic signal through his own equipment on a continuous loop, listening over and over in what I have to believe, given everything else we'd already witnessed, was an attempt to finally, fully decode something the rest of us had already stopped believing was safe to understand. I was the one who found him. I remember the specific mundane wrongness of the scene before I fully understood what I was looking at. His posture too still, his hands resting on the console's edge in a way that looked, for one disorienting second, like simple concentration rather than anything final. His monitor still displayed the same slowed, filtered waveform he'd been showing us all 2 weeks earlier, looping without end, and beside his keyboard, in his own small, careful handwriting, on a single torn page from his logbook, was a note that read only, "I think I finally understand the shape of it. I wish I could tell someone before I forget again." I don't know what he meant by again. I have never been able to stop wondering whether he believed in some genuinely felt way that he had understood it before at some earlier point none of the rest of us witnessed, and lost that understanding each time the way a dream dissolves on waking, only to feel compelled to chase it back down each night regardless. His heart had simply stopped. The station's automated medical monitoring flagged no prior cardiac irregularity in 11 months of continuous data. Amara, examining him, found no obvious physical cause at all, and told Kes and me quietly in words I have never fully been able to stop hearing, that she believes some things can simply be listened to for too long, regardless of what specific mechanism eventually claims the person doing the listening. The recovery vessel's crew, understandably, treated the 3 of us with a caution that bordered on suspicion during the ascent. 3 survivors out of an original 6, 2 confirmed dead by walking unsuited into 6,000 meters of open ocean, 1 dead of causes the recovery team's own onboard physician couldn't immediately explain. Nobody said much during that ascent. I remember standing at a small viewport as the water outside gradually shifted from absolute black to a deep, distant blue, and feeling, instead of relief, a strange, disorienting grief at leaving that darkness behind, a feeling I didn't admit to anyone else aboard that vessel, and have only rarely admitted since because I understood, even as I felt it, exactly how it would sound spoken aloud. We were debriefed extensively by personnel whose actual employer none of us was ever clearly told. Over the following weeks, men and women in plain, unbadged clothing who asked careful, patient questions in a windowless room, always circling back, gently but persistently, to whether any of us could offer a conventional explanation for what we'd experienced, in a tone that made unmistakably clear which category of answer they were hoping to hear. Kess, in the one conversation the three of us managed to have together before we were separated for individual follow-up sessions, said she thought they already knew more than they were letting on, that their questions had a specificity to them, an occasional slip into terminology that felt too precise for people encountering our account for the first time. I've never been able to confirm that suspicion, but I've never fully shaken it either. Every version of the official incident report I've since been permitted to see, heavily redacted, months delayed, released only after considerable legal pressure from Iris's family and Owen's, attributes what happened aboard Aphotic 9 to cumulative psychological stress consistent with prolonged extreme depth isolation, a diagnosis that technically doesn't lie about anything we experienced while also, deliberately, I believe, avoiding any acknowledgement of the specific structure we found, the specific acoustic signal Tobias spent his final hours trying to decode, or the specific words Owen used, sitting in that galley, trying to explain what he believed he understood about something that had been alone in the dark for longer than human language has existed. I have not been back to sea since. I don't think I ever will be, not seriously, not the way that career once meant everything to me. I still catch myself some nights lying awake with the specific low-grade sense I first described to Amara in that fifth-day conversation, the feeling of something being called toward, faint and directionless, though it has, at least, never again resolved into anything as clear as those first shared dreams aboard Aphotic 9. I've mentioned this once to a therapist I started seeing shortly after the debriefings ended, carefully omitting most of the specifics in a way that I suspect made my account sound like a fairly ordinary description of prolonged trauma-related insomnia, and I let her believe that because the alternative explanation was not one I trusted either of us to productively sit with in a 50-minute session. Kess works now, as far as I know, in a considerably shallower branch of marine engineering, something closer to coastal infrastructure, and we speak occasionally careful conversations that circle everything except the thing we actually shared, the way people do when a shared trauma is too large and too strange to safely hold between two people at once. She told me once, in one of the only conversations where either of us came close to actually naming what happened, that she still checks every hatch mechanism twice before using it no matter how mundane the building, and that some part of her expects every single time for it to resist her the way Marlowe's thrusters resisted for those 11 seconds. I told her I understood completely, and I did, and neither of us needed to say anything else about it after that. Amara left medicine entirely, the last I heard, and I don't know where she is now, and some part of me hopes, genuinely, that wherever she went, it's somewhere far enough from any large body of water that the 6-minute rhythm she spent that whole rotation carefully, professionally tracking has finally had a chance to fade from whatever part of her mind first learned to recognize it. I think about her more than I probably should, given how relatively brief our actual working relationship was. 6 weeks before everything started, 5 weeks of shared catastrophe afterward, but I think trauma compresses time in strange ways, and some part of me will always measure the length of my knowing her not in weeks but in the specific unbearable density of what we survived together. Part 8. Still singing. I want to end this account honestly, rather than with some tidy warning I don't actually believe protects anyone, because I don't think there's a clean rule here the way there sometimes is in stories like this. No salt line, no name you shouldn't speak, no object you can find and destroy to make it stop. What I believe, after 14 months on that station and 8 more months of trying and mostly failing to process what happened there, is considerably simpler and considerably harder to defend against. I believe something enormously old lives at the bottom of that trench, and I believe it has been alone there for a length of time that makes human history look like a single held breath, and I believe that loneliness, at a scale that vast and that ancient, produces something that isn't cruelty in any sense we'd recognize but functions from the outside, exactly like cruelty regardless of its actual intention. I believe Owen was probably right about what it wants. I don't think that makes it safe. I think an ocean that vast and that dark has room for things whose wants, however genuinely felt, however free of anything we'd recognize as malice, are simply, catastrophically incompatible with anything built to survive on the sunlit side of the world. I've spent a considerable portion of the last 8 months trying to understand why some of us went into the water and some of us didn't. Amara has her own theory, one she shared with me only once late at night, in the weeks right after we surfaced, before either of us had really begun processing any of it properly. She thinks it isn't about individual weakness or individual strength at all, that Iris and Owen weren't somehow less resilient than Kes or Amara or myself, and Tobias wasn't somehow more vulnerable for having spent so many hours actively studying the signal rather than simply enduring it. She thinks it's closer to a matter of what each of us was already carrying privately into that rotation before any of this ever started. Some particular ache or loneliness or unfinished grief that the signal, whatever it actually was, could find purchase in and slowly, patiently widen. She pointed out, gently, that Iris had lost her mother only 8 months before the rotation began, a fact she'd mentioned to Amara once, in confidence, early in their acquaintance, and never brought up again. She pointed out that Owen had been divorced for 6 years and had told her, once, almost in passing, that his ex-wife had remarried and that he sometimes worried he'd built his entire remaining life around research postings specifically because there was no longer anyone waiting for him back on land regardless of how long he stayed away. I don't know if either of those facts actually explains anything. I've decided in the months since that I don't think there's a satisfying explanation waiting at the bottom of any of this, and that searching for one too persistently is its own kind of danger, an echo, in a much smaller and more survivable form, of exactly the compulsion that cost Tobias his life at that console on our final morning. Site designation Kestrelfold remains, as far as I've been able to determine through the handful of contacts I still maintain from that world, formally decommissioned, its coordinates flagged, quietly, as unsuitable for further manned research, though I've also heard, secondhand, unconfirmed, that unmanned monitoring equipment was left in place, continuing to record the same 6-minute acoustic cycle Tobias spent his final night trying to understand, and that the cycle, as of the last data pull anyone's been willing to describe to me, has not once stopped, has not once changed, in all the months since 3 of us surfaced and left 4 of the 6 of us behind. I don't know what it would mean for that cycle to finally stop. I've decided honestly that I don't want to be the one who finds out, and if anything I've told you here ever reaches someone with the kind of authority or curiosity that might otherwise send them looking, I am asking you, as plainly and as sincerely as I know how, on behalf of Iris and Owen and Tobias, and on behalf of whatever's left of the parts of Amara and Kes and myself that never fully came back up with us. Some depths were never built to be visited by anything that needs the sun. Let it keep singing to the dark. Don't go find out what happens if you finally answer.